Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for showing up this morning to officially welcome back Kelly Krauskopf as President of Basketball Business Operations for the Indiana.
Imagine building something for decades, pouring your sweat, your sacrifice, your entire identity into a league that the world largely ignored. You fought for every dollar, every television slot, every fan who bothered to show up. And then, almost overnight, a 22-year-old walks through the door and changes everything. The ticket sales, the television ratings, the cultural conversation, and suddenly, nobody is talking about everything that came before her. Now ask yourself, how would that make you feel? That tension, that collision between past and present, between entitlement and evolution, between institutional pride and undeniable financial reality, sits at the very core of one of the most explosive, controversial, and consequential stories in the history of women's professional sports. Because what is happening to Caitlyn Clark inside the WNBA is not simply the story of a talented rookie navigating a difficult adjustment period. It is something far more complicated, far more troubling, and far more revealing about the nature of power, money, ego, and institutional self-destruction. The question that millions of fans, analysts, and observers are now asking out loud is one that would have seemed completely absurd just 2 years ago. Is the WNBA, its veterans, its leadership, its establishment actively working against the one player who has the singular generational ability to transform women's basketball into a mainstream global phenomenon? The evidence, when examined honestly and in full, is deeply unsettling. When the Indiana Fever selected Caitlyn Clark with the first overall pick in the 2024 WNBA draft, the moment carried the weight of genuine historical significance. This was not hyperbole. This was not manufactured media excitement designed to fill airtime. The numbers told the story with cold, irrefutable clarity. Clark had shattered NCAA scoring records that had stood for decades. Her college games were drawing viewership figures that embarrassed major professional sports events, including MLB playoff matchups and Stanley Cup Finals games. She had achieved something almost no athlete in modern sports history had managed. She had made a niche product feel absolutely essential to the general public. Casual sports fans who had never once tuned into a women's basketball game were suddenly rearranging their schedules to watch her play. The financial tremors she sent through the league were immediate and extraordinary. Tickets to Indiana Fever games, once available for modest prices with little competition, suddenly appeared on secondary markets at prices that rivaled playoff basketball. Arenas that had grown accustomed to rows of empty seats were selling out within minutes of tickets being released. The economic transformation was so dramatic and so undeniable that the WNBA itself was compelled to upgrade its travel arrangements, from commercial flights to private charters, a direct, tangible consequence of Clark's presence, elevating the league's commercial profile almost overnight. She was, by every measurable standard, exactly what women's professional basketball had been waiting for. A transcendent crossover star, capable of doing what generations of genuinely talented players before her had failed to accomplish, not through any fault of their own, but simply because the cultural moment had not yet arrived. Caitlyn Clark was that moment, personified. Everything was perfectly positioned for a triumphant arrival. The stage was set for a coronation. What happened instead was something else entirely. From almost the very beginning of her professional career, it became apparent that Caitlyn Clark would not be welcomed. She would be tested, physically, psychologically, and institutionally. The on-court physicality she faced as a rookie was, by any objective standard, extraordinary. Veterans were not merely playing tough defense. They were delivering a message through hard screens, deliberate pushes, and targeted physical contact that communicated something far beyond normal competitive intensity. There is a long-standing tradition in professional sports of veterans testing rookies, establishing the hierarchy, and letting young players know they must earn their place. That is understood and accepted as part of the game. But what Clark experienced appeared to transcend that tradition in ways that were difficult to ignore. and impossible to fully rationalize. The moment that crystallized everything, the single incident that transformed a competitive narrative into a national conversation, occurred during a game against the Chicago Sky. Kennedy Carter delivered a blindside shoulder hit on Clark that had no legitimate basketball justification. It was not a box out. It was not a hard screen. It was not an aggressive but defensible competitive play. It was a direct, physical assault executed away from the ball, and it sent Clark forcefully to the ground in a manner that shocked everyone watching. The reaction was immediate and global. The clip circulated across every platform within hours, drawing condemnation from athletes, analysts, and fans across the full spectrum of sports. What amplified the outrage was the context surrounding the moment, Carter's complete refusal to engage with questions about the play afterward, and the visible, joyful celebration from the sideline that followed. A celebration that many observers found not only unsportsmanlike, but deeply revealing of an underlying attitude toward Clark that extended well beyond competitive rivalry. The WNBA's initial response to the incident was, to put it charitably, inadequate. The league classified it as a common foul. It was only reclassified as a flagrant foul after an overwhelming wave of public criticism made the original ruling untenable. The message that classification sent before it was reversed was unmistakable to millions of watching fans. The league's biggest star would not receive the protection she deserved. She was on her own. While the external hostility was visible and widely documented, a more disturbing narrative was developing in a place no one wanted to look: inside the Indiana Fever's own locker room. As the season progressed, analysts, retired players, and engaged fans began noticing a pattern in game footage that was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Caitlyn Clark, arguably the most dangerous perimeter shooter in the game, would position herself in open space, hands raised, clearly available for the pass, and the ball would go elsewhere. Not occasionally, as any offensive system naturally distributes, but repeatedly, consistently, and in situations where the basketball logic clearly favored finding Clark. Passes were forced into congested paint situations where defenders were doubled and scoring opportunities were dramatically reduced. Meanwhile, one of the most gifted shooters in the history of the sport stood unguarded on the perimeter, effectively removed from the offensive equation. Body language on the court told its own complicated story: frustrated glances, tension in huddles, a team chemistry that appeared not merely underdeveloped, as one might reasonably expect from a roster still integrating a transformative new talent, but fractured in ways that suggested something more deliberate and more corrosive. The theory that emerged from fan communities and filtered into mainstream sports media was uncomfortable but logical. Was Clark being deliberately frozen out by teammates who resented the attention, the enormous Nike contract, the signature shoe deal, and the fundamental reality that a two-year-old rookie had arrived and immediately become the defining identity of the franchise? Were players who had invested years building careers in relative obscurity now sabotaging the woman who had, through no fault of her own, made everything they had previously accomplished feel invisible by comparison? These were deeply serious allegations. They were not made lightly, and they were never definitively proven. But the tape existed. The pattern was real. And the evasive, carefully corporate post-game responses from veteran players like Aaliyah Boston, responses that carefully avoided the actual questions being asked, did nothing to dispel the growing suspicion that something deeply uncomfortable was happening behind closed doors. If the on-court aggression and the possible internal friction represented the street-level manifestation of the resistance to Clark, then the media landscape provided its institutional voice. Prominent, current, and former WNBA players lined up to contextualize, minimize, and normalize what Clark was experiencing in ways that served an obvious purpose. The most notable contribution came from WNBA legend Diana Taurasi, who delivered a pointed, coldly prophetic assessment of Clark's impending professional reality before Clark had even been drafted. In retrospect, that assessment reads less like experienced analysis and more like a forewarning, a signal from the established order that the newcomer should not expect accommodation or protection. The collective media narrative pushed by veteran voices was consistent. Clark was simply experiencing the standard treatment any rookie receives. Nothing to see here. Move along. Welcome to the league. The problem with that narrative was its fundamental dishonesty. No rookie in the history of professional sports had entered a league carrying the commercial weight that Clark carried. No previous first-year player had been single-handedly responsible for transforming league economics, filling 20,000-seat arenas, or driving television rights negotiations to quadruple their previous value. The standard rookie treatment framework simply did not apply, and applying it anyway felt less like genuine analysis and more like deliberate gaslighting. The conversation also inevitably intersected with deeply sensitive questions of race and representation. The WNBA is a league built predominantly by Black women whose extraordinary talent and sacrifice created something meaningful from almost nothing, operating for decades without the recognition or financial reward their abilities deserved. The arrival of a white player who immediately attracted a level of mainstream media attention that those women never received through no fault of Clark's own created a legitimate and understandable tension that deserved honest, nuanced discussion. What was not acceptable, however, was using that legitimate cultural complexity as cover for physical aggression, deliberate exclusion, or institutional decision-making that harmed the very league those women had sacrificed to build. Two things could be simultaneously true. The long-overlooked contributions of Black women to the WNBA deserved greater recognition and celebration, and Caitlyn Clark deserved to compete without being targeted for coordinated physical and institutional punishment. Every preceding incident, the deliberate physicality, the possible locker room freeze-out, the establishment media campaign could conceivably be explained, rationalized, or contextualized in ways that stopped short of concluding there was an organized, institutional effort to diminish Caitlyn Clark, taken individually. Each episode had alternative explanations available. Then came the Olympic roster decision, and alternative explanations became nearly impossible to construct. Caitlyn Clark was not selected for the United States Olympic basketball team heading to the Paris Games. The player who had, in a single season, done more to expand the audience, visibility, and commercial value of women's basketball than any individual in the history of the sport was told she was not good enough to be a reserve on the national team. Players with fewer accolades, worse statistical profiles, and a fraction of Clark's cultural impact made the roster. She did not. The official justifications offered by USA Basketball were transparently insufficient. They cited her limited experience with the senior national program and the importance of team cohesion reasoning that collapsed under the slightest scrutiny given the roster that was ultimately assembled. What the decision actually communicated was something far simpler and far more damaging. This is our institution, these are our people, and you have not been granted membership, regardless of your talent, your impact, or your commercial value to the sport we represent. It was gatekeeping executed at the highest possible level. A formal declaration from the establishment that popularity, revenue generation, and extraordinary individual ability were insufficient credentials for admission to the inner circle. The decision was not merely unjust, it was strategically suicidal. The WNBA was on the verge of the most significant television rights negotiation in its history, with projections suggesting the league's value could increase from approximately $60 million to well over $200 million, a transformation driven almost entirely by the Clark effect. And in that precise moment, the people responsible for stewarding the sport's growth made a decision that alienated millions of new fans, generated overwhelmingly negative global press coverage, and demonstrated that institutional pride would consistently override sound commercial judgment. When the Olympic snub ignited a worldwide firestorm, the eyes of the sports world returned to Indianapolis. The Indiana Fever organization, the team that had built its entire commercial revival on Caitlyn Clark's shoulders, that was filling arenas and selling merchandise at unprecedented rates because of her presence, had an opportunity to stand up for their player in a meaningful, public, and forceful way. They could have issued a strong statement condemning the selection committee's decision. They could have publicly and passionately defended the player who was generating tens of millions of dollars for their franchise. They could have demonstrated, clearly and unambiguously, that they stood with Clark against the institutional forces working against her. Instead, the Fever's front office released carefully worded, thoroughly sanitized corporate statements about focusing on the WNBA season, Clark's bright future, and the organization's long-term vision. No anger, no advocacy, no fight. The silence where genuine support should have existed was deafening and ultimately devastating. This was the most revealing moment of the entire saga. It exposed with painful clarity that for the Indiana Fever's leadership, Caitlyn Clark was primarily a financial instrument extraordinarily valuable, yes, but ultimately a commodity to be managed rather than a person to be protected. When protecting her would have required challenging the league's entrenched power structure, the organization calculated that their own political position within that structure mattered more than their star players' dignity and well-being. It was a profound betrayal, executed quietly, cloaked in corporate language, and all the more damaging for its deliberateness. At the core of this entire story lies a contradiction so fundamental and so self-destructive that it defies rational explanation from a purely business perspective. The WNBA desperately needs everything that Caitlyn Clark represents: the new fans, the television revenue, the cultural relevance, the sold-out arenas, the national conversation, the legitimacy in the broader sports marketplace that the league has spent nearly 3 decades trying to achieve. Clark did not merely accelerate that progress, she compressed what might have taken a generation into a single season. And yet the league's establishment, its veteran players, its selection committees, its front offices appears constitutionally incapable of embracing the change she represents without simultaneously attempting to punish her for representing it. This is not rational behavior from an organizational standpoint. You do not physically target your most valuable commercial asset. You do not freeze out the player whose presence is responsible for your league's most significant revenue growth in its history. You do not exclude her from your flagship international showcase when the entire world is watching specifically because she exists. Unless the motivating forces are not rational, unless pride, ego, resentment, cultural anxiety, and institutional self-preservation have completely overridden sound judgment at every level of the organization simultaneously. That is precisely what appears to have occurred. Caitlyn Clark has already proven something that no amount of institutional resistance can erase. She is a generational talent, a transformative cultural figure, an athlete whose impact on women's professional basketball is already permanent and irreversible, regardless of what happens next. But the WNBA stands at a genuine crossroads, and the path it chooses in the coming seasons will define not just one player's career, but the entire trajectory of women's professional basketball for the next generation. One path leads toward extraordinary prosperity. It requires the league's establishment, its veterans, its committees, its front offices to set aside ego, resentment, and territorial instinct, and recognize that Clark's rise does not diminish what came before, it illuminates it. It creates a platform large enough to finally give the generations of overlooked players the recognition and financial reward they always deserved. A genuinely rising tide lifts every boat, but only if those already in the water stop trying to sink the wave. The other path is one the WNBA has been dangerously close to walking throughout this entire saga. It is the path of institutional self-destruction, of sacrificing unprecedented growth for the satisfaction of keeping a disruptive outsider in her place. It is the path that produces short-term comfort for the established order and long-term catastrophe for the sport itself. millions of new fans came to women's basketball because of Caitlyn Clark. They are watching everything. They are documenting everything. They are making decisions about their continued investment in this league based on what they observe. Every act of unchallenged aggression, every suspicious freeze-out, every unjust roster exclusion, every moment of organizational silence when advocacy was desperately needed, they see all of it, and they are drawing conclusions. The WNBA has been given the rarest gift in professional sports, a second chance at becoming something truly significant on the global stage. The question is devastatingly simple. Is the league's establishment wise enough, humble enough, and forward-thinking enough to accept that gift? Or is it so consumed by the politics of the past that it will spend the next decade explaining to a generation of former fans why it chose pride over prosperity, gatekeeping over growth, and ego over an opportunity that may never come again? The answer to that question will determine everything. And Caitlyn Clark, through all of it, the fouls, the freeze-outs, the snubs, and the betrayals, keeps playing, keeps shooting, keeps drawing crowds. The golden goose is still producing. The only remaining question is whether the people holding the keys to the henhouse are determined to destroy what they were given the extraordinary privilege of protecting. The game is bigger than any single institution. It always has been. The WNBA would do well to remember that before the moment passes.